الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله.
As the 18th century kicked in, the Ottoman Empire remained a formidable military force and continued to experience economic growth. But the Ottomans' disastrous war with Russia from 1768, ending with the humiliating Treaty of Küçükçaynaca in 1774, was a changing of the guard in some respects. Prior to this period, the Porte had been the premier power across Eurasia. That title now went to Russia, while on their western flank, the Ottomans had to contend with Austria's imperial ambitions. And within but a century, Britain was to surpass all, to become the dominant global empire amongst global empires, and the greatest naval power the world had ever seen. The Ottomans were of course conscious of how far their war machine had fallen behind their Christian rivals, leading some sultans to institute reforms with varying success. But a far more consequential reform movement was making waves just beyond the Ottoman Empire's borders, one whose effects continue to shape and impact our present day long after the book of Ottoman history has closed. We're speaking here of course of the da'wah of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. But before we tell that story, in order to establish some continuity, it's worth first taking a step back to recap the relevant events at the close of the previous 17th century. We'd previously mentioned how, following the failure of the Ottomans to take Vienna in 1683, the Koprulu clan's influence at Constantinople also took a dive. The pietism and purity of creed they'd patronized did, however, continue to thrive, such as among scholars native to the northern shores of the Black Sea coast. But it was in Damascus, in Ottoman Syria, where the legacy of the Taymiyyan Turks would impact the most. In fact, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that popular Sufism in 18th century Damascus was under serious pressure to sober up from the same Salafistic current that had hounded the drunken mystics in the taverns and tekhes of Constantinople the previous century. One notorious Gnostic, regarded as the greatest Sufi of Ottoman Syria, Abdul Ghani an-Nablusi, tried to push back. Through his prolific works, he authored over 300 books, we get a sense of just how threatened for the Sufi way of life he felt. Nablusi was a mufti of Damascus and taught at the city's Grand Umayyad Mosque before he went into a 7-year seclusion, or khalwa. Upon emerging, he devoted himself to refuting Sufism's critics, writing in defense of a wide range of controversial esoteric indulgences, from whirling to smoking to Ibn Arabi. Matters admitted to by Abdul Hakim Murad, Christian name Timothy, or if we're feeling a bit silly, we'll call him Timmy.
Timmy! So he has dreams of Ibn Arabi. He sees himself as a baby suckling from Ibn Arabi, who is like a mother.
Suckling Ibn Arabi's teat is fitting, considering Nablusi also wrote hedonistic shirk-infested homoerotic poetry in ode to the pederistic Sufi tradition of ritually leering at the beautiful form of young males, especially to the accompaniment of music and dance during the Sama' sessions, until Allah's divine presence is said to be witnessed.
Witnessing divine beauty perceived through the beauty of a male, and shahid bazi as the act of falling in love with a beautiful male, which is also synonymous with lavat or sodomy.
And some of his poetry reflects this, including some poetry which, to the rather pinched modern anxiety focus of modern Islam, seems a bit scandalous.
Nah, that ain't it. I ain't no prude. We all like a perv now and then.
Did I say that out loud?
But that's regards lusting over what's lawful, the sex that is a sadaqah. As the Prophet ﷺ said, in your sexual intercourse there is charity. The companions asked, O Messenger of Allah, is there reward for him among us who satisfies his carnal desire? The Prophet replied, do you not see that if he were to satisfy himself in something forbidden, he'd earn a sin? So similarly, if he were to satisfy it in what is lawful, he'd have a reward. Our objection, then, is not against being sexual, but homosexual.
It's not where ulama tend to go nowadays. But in that world, that was also part of what the Sufis would call Shahid Bazi, gazing upon the beauties of the human form in order to learn about the creative magnificence of the compassionate God, a practice that Sufis were often reprehended for.
Since gazing at the beauty of adolescent boys could have led to sexual consummation, one partner would have been active and the other one passive. The passive partner would have therefore been subject to derision because they would have crossed the gender boundaries by allowing themselves to be emasculated and feminized.
Now, he's not actually got girls around in these gatherings, but this literary tradition means that he's one of the sort of major amatory and erotic poets of the Arabic language.
I feel tingly.
Yes, that's love, my friend. And it's time for you to learn all about it.
And he writes a book about love.
The command to compose it came to my inner being Thursday night, 12 Dhul Qa'dah in 1096, when I heard a caller from the spirit world, in the absence of ghosts, as mouthed by one sleeping besides me.
In which he talks about romantic love as being a divine gift that is a prophetic state that helps us to transcend more earthly passions, focuses us on contemplating the imago Dei, the presence of the sacred in another human being.
Actually, Nablusi's love book is an argument for intense platonic love between boys and older men.
Timmy, did you not do your homework?
The word platonic comes from Plato, of course, and the Sufi master-murid relationship. The path to gnosis a young apprentice takes through his bonding with an older man is as Greek as Gandhuism itself.
Plato structured the, quote, love relation as a relation to truth by placing it in the one who is loved as well as in the one who is in love, and by reversing the roles of the loved young man, making him a lover of a master of truth. In this way, Platonic erotics made the topic of truth, which is with capital T, meaning the divine, a pivotal element into this type of relationship. Consequently, men and women became objects of divine contemplation. However, since the presence of women in Sufi lodges would create uproar and chaos in society, Sufis often prefer to choose young men, such as pretty young slaves or disciples, as ideal of beauty and objects of divine contemplation. Now, the Sufis were expected to admire the beauty of these young boys, which would lead them to that Platonic truth. Hence, falling in love hopelessly with an adolescent boy became a familiar trope in Sufi literature.
Thus, from Plato, Sufis learned how to love God, just as from his student Aristotle, Ash'aris learned how to conceive of God, how to believe, or rather disbelieve, in his attributes, as according to their adopted Hellenic sensibilities, to take the divine attributes on their apparent, intended meaning would be to anthropomorphize Allah. And yet, they claim that a state of gnosis, a mystical meta-knowledge of the metaphysical God, may be attained by loving the anthropomorphic form of adolescent males, almost willing Allah to become incarnate within the physical male form. The contradiction is incredible.
ليس كمثله شيء ليس كمثله شيء وهو السميع البصير وهو السميع البصير.
Then there's the blurred lines between philosophy and pederasty, between the sharing of wisdom and the sharing of beds, as is suggested in this portrayal of Aristotle with his adolescent Macedons.
When men lie together and knowledge and virtue are passed between them, that is pure and excellent. When they compete to bring out the good, the best in each other, this is the love between men that can build the city-state. and lift us from our frog pond.
But can a man love a woman equally, Master?
A woman? Of course not.
So here we are with all my friends, and they love you, all of them.
Yes, we do.
It is true.
We love you.
You love us too.
I love you too, Barry boy.
Harder.
Unsurprisingly, Abdul Ghani an-Nablusi was accused of promoting homosexuality, and so was forced to clarify how he considered homosexual acts to be sins of the utmost profanity.
A guy who's going to go and penetrate and sodomize another guy. A guy who's going to literally insert his genitals into another man's back passage. Does that make sense?
It does, absolutely. But creedally, what hululists, wahdatul wujudists advocate
The presence of the sacred in another human being
is no less an obscenity. In response to one Ottoman scholar who had dared deconstruct some of Ibn Arabi's pantheism, Nablusi penned the polemic, "The true statement concerning the permissibility of forsaking the threat of eternal damnation and the refutation of the ignorant and stubborn Rumi."
There has appeared in the land of Rum a man from the louts of the deserts and the unlucky ones of the steppe, who charges with unbelief the Arab and son of the Arab.
And this is a play on words, as he intends Muhyiddin ibn Arabi.
He does that despite his being a non-Arab, foreigner, son of a foreigner, while the Arabs are the masters of the Persians and Turks, as the scholars have agreed. And it is known that the Arabs are those who brought the Turk into Islam by the tips of their dark spears and the blades of their bright swords.
Point of fact, it was the Iranic Samanids who brought the Oghuz Turks to Islam. And then those Turks, as Ottomans, steered Greeks, Slavs, Albanians and Magyars of the formerly Eastern Roman realm under the Islamic helm. Rather than specify who he's disparaging of peoples Islamized by Turks as distinct from actual Turks, Nablusi lumps them all together as one foreign body unequal to the Arab. Continuing his tirade against his
suckling mother,
Ibn Arabi's Sunni critic, Nablusi opines,
Perhaps he was one of those infidels forced by the Arabs into Islam, who denies the truth out of ignorance. Perhaps the ignorant rejecter of truth was a Christian recently converted to Islam, who put on a white turban and dressed as Muslims do. And only Allah knows what's in his heart near or far. The ignoramus has forgotten how he was fighting the people of Islam, deifying Christ, eating pork, and worshipping idols. If he were to spit, wine would have exited his mouth.
Like the one who worships shrines after having been raised upon Islam is in any place to criticize Greek converts to the religion for having worshipped Jesus in their Jahiliyyah. In fact, we find Nablusi repeatedly identifying those he opposed as Rumis. Rumi, plural Arwam, is a noun that should denote a native of Anatolia and the Balkans, the territory that's more or less congruent with the ancient Greek-speaking world that was the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, as per Allah's usage of the term in the Quran.
Alif Lam Mim غلبت الروم في أدنى الأرض وهم من بعد غلبهم سيغلبون.
Since the 11th century, however, Rome became restricted to Anatolia, while by around the 14th century, Thrace and the Balkans became differentiated as Rumelia. The most noble person to wear Rumi as his laqab or title was the noble Sahabi Suhaib ibn Sinan, who was named Ar-Rumi after having been captured by Byzantine raiders and sold into slavery in Constantinople. Perhaps the second most famous person to wear the Rumi moniker was Jalal ad-Din Rumi, founder of the Mevlevi Sufi order. Although born a Persian, he quit his native Khorasan to settle in Konya, capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. The whirling dervishes and the associated Sama'a concerts originated with the Mevlevi order, but Jalal ad-Din Rumi is more universally known for his homoerotic poetry, where he speaks of God as if he were his lover. Nablusi's usage of the Rumi label here, as elsewhere, is derogatory. It conveys his disdain for those who are, if not lesser Muslim Turks, still no more than honorary Turks in his eyes. In addition to his Arab chauvinism, in his disdain for his detractors for their daring to question the permissibility of innovated indulgences, Nablusi unwittingly evidences their common sense as well as their greater concern for the ordinances of the Sharia. What's more, the antagonism his acts stoked also evidences how the shirkiyat and bid'at of what is now regarded as popular Sufism was, in the 17th century Ottoman Sultanate, being questioned by the citizenry just as it was being quashed by the state. Take, for example, the treatise, The Compendium of Secrets to Prevent the Evil Ones from Defaming Good Sufis. In the opening page, Nablusi gives us his motivation for writing this text.
A letter came to me from some Sufi sheikhs of a particular Islamic land and raised questions arising from some indignant Turks who object to followers of the tariqah as pertains to the state of the dhikr, of voices raised in majesty and sometimes whirling in a state of ecstasy.
And how does the author proceed to answer his critics? By appealing to weak and fabricated hadith, and by storytelling with Sufi fables. Not that loud communal dhikr and devotional dancing are the acts of disbelief Ottoman pietists made them out to be. Granted, these matters are not from the Sunnah, but relatively speaking, head-bopping at the mosque is not a sin so grave, not compared to the actual kufr that some get up to when they worship the saint at his grave. Here too, Nablusi writes in aid of those seeking aid from the dead. And here too, he relies on mawdu'at and khurafat to justify the innovated acts of the shrine venerating jama'at.
Between 1689 and 1700, he is basically travelling. And he travels as a Sufi. This is the Sufi tradition of siyaha, and it's Quranically mandated.
Nablusi's travelogue, Reality and Metaphor on the Voyage to the Levant, Egypt and the Hijaz, was a write-up of all the graves of Sahaba and saints he and his troop visited, and some of the innovations they witnessed and performed there.
The Sheikh roved with them all over Syria to visit the places of the prophets and saints that were there, and kept journeying with them until they reached Al-Arish in Egypt, from which he travelled by land to Cairo.
Even while detailing religious rituals at the shrines of the dead, Nablusi makes space to throw shade at the living.
At times, some of the critics from among the Turks are there, but they are unable to restrain themselves from the delirious state which descends upon them unawares, or from the humility which overwhelms them. And I found one of them on another Friday, after I had attended this concert alone with some of my group. The Turk said to me, "Sir, this thing that they do here at the shrine, is it halal or haram?" But I refrained from speaking with him and patiently endured him until the concert began. Then he was seized by the state of delirium, and I haven't seen him since.
At the tomb of a Cairene Sufi, Nablusi remarks,
"I've witnessed people at the time of the summer and other times circling the grave of Sheikh Amr and calling out to him for blessings and prayers for good fortune derived from his attendant spirit and his dazzling divine secrets. Then Allah the Exalted reaches out to them and fulfills their needs in accordance with his saying, 'O you who believe, do your duty to Allah and fear him and seek the means of approach to him. And there are no means mightier with Allah the Exalted than the souls of his awliya, good and pure, and the light of their graves, brilliant and clear.'"
To cite this passage,
يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وابتغوا إليه الوسيلة,
as if it's an evidence for the tawassul of tombs, as if worshipping the dead is a means of drawing nearer to Allah, is a perverse abuse of the Quran. Qatada, the Tabi of the Sahabi, Abdullah ibn Abbas, commented, "Seeking the means of approach to Allah is by obeying Him and performing the acts that please Him." And the remainder of the verse mentions one such deed that is pleasing to Allah.
وجاهدوا في سبيله لعلكم تفلحون.
And strive hard, make jihad in his cause as much as you can, that you may be successful. And in rebuke of those who claim they are making tawassul to Allah by venerating other than Him, Ibn Kathir cites another ayah.
أولئك الذين يدعون يبتغون إلى ربهم الوسيلة أيهم أقرب.
Even the closest of those whom they call upon themselves desire a means of approach to their Lord. The most cunning of Nablusi's attempts to push back against Salafistic Turks' objections to Sufi occultism and innovation was his neutralizing commentary on Imam Birghivi's At-Tariqa al-Muhammadiyya, the Muhammadan Path. Nablusi titled his work The Dewy Garden Explaining the Muhammadan Path.
He also writes a book that becomes much more widespread and is still quite widely read, which is a commentary on a book by somebody called Muhammad bin Pir Ali al-Birghavi, who's an Ottoman scholar and preacher in Istanbul, called At-Tariqa al-Muhammadiyya, the Muhammadan Way.
Birghivi's goal was to admonish Ottoman society, to turn them away from the excesses and innovations of Sufi tariqas, those who he called al-Mutasawwifa al-Jahala, the ignorant Sufis, and to return them instead to the inspired tariqa of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Sunnah. By taking the text of Birghivi's tariqa and making it his own, Nablusi was attempting to both explain away Birghivi's objections to extreme Sufi practices while disingenuously associating his notorious Nablusian name with the most celebrated scholar in Ottoman history. Thus did the greatest Sufi of the Ottoman Empire attempt to appropriate the legacy of the greatest scholar in the history of the empire. Considering Nablusi's justifying calling upon spirits of the dead, as doing so is the greatest means of drawing nearer to Allah, so he said, it should come as no surprise that he brags of forsaking the revealed knowledge which the Prophet ﷺ spread, forsaking it for the so-called divine secrets which were but voices in his head. In a letter to one of his devotees, a Constantinople-based dignitary, Nablusi confesses,
I have now completely abandoned the outer sciences because they are illusionary. The tools to their perception and awareness are but imagination and thought, and I have embraced with all of my being the true hidden sciences because they alone are beneficial. And the hidden sciences are a taste, an unveiling, and ecstasy. Not for everyone is this taste, unveiling, and ecstasy.
This isn't piety. The mystics claim to have reached a station where divine truths are unveiled to him, as if he were granted prophethood in secret, receiving knowledge which from the followers of Muhammad ﷺ is concealed, while the prophets were themselves ordered to follow naught but that which was to them revealed.
وإذا لم تأتهم بآية قالوا لولا اجتبيتها قل إنما أتبع ما يوحى إلي من ربي هذا بصائر من ربكم وهدى ورحمة لقوم يؤمنون.
And if you do not bring them a miracle, they say, why have you not brought it? Say, I but follow what is revealed to me from my Lord. This is nothing but insight from your Lord, and a guidance and a mercy for a people who believe. When a man reaches such hubris as to hold the pursuit of knowledge of Allah through the book and the Sunnah to be the ritualistic pursuit of plebs, to such a man actual ritual acts of worship are performed as if a circus act. While Nablusi was in his 90s, we're told how
إيه لو Krad would gather in his home in Ramadan, sanctified be his secret, whom he would lead in Tarawih prayers. أني لو نسيد him would sing بالminstrels, who would perform after every 4 ركعات, songs accompanied by musical instruments, and they would prolong their performance so that the master might have a smoke.
Most disconcerting of all was that Nablusi's delusion descended to such a depth that he discarded all notion of any distinction between his and the divine self.
My Lord said to me, You are all that is within me, and I am all that is within thee. He appeared to me in my form and said, I am the absolute being, and you are my restricted form. Then he called out to me through my own calling, and he revealed his essence and my essence to me, and I did not find but one voice speaking, and I witnessed the presence of one being. And I came to know that duality in speech, and of one being spoken to, is pure illusion and reckoning.
This speech is brazen blasphemy.
سبحانه وتعالى عما يقولون علوا كبيرا.
It's blasphemy of the highest order. It betrays a disbelief, the kufr of the monist pantheistic disorder, more commonly referred to in Arabic amongst Ibn Arabists as wahdatul wujud, a belief in the oneness of being between the creator and the created, a kufri credo similar to the notion of hulul, the alleged indwelling of Allah within man.
سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون.
In light of Nablusi's heresies, it was inevitable that observant Sunni Muslims would be on his case and he on theirs.
And there's a puritanical movement led by somebody called Qadizadeh, who was a disciple of Birgavi but became really quite narrow and extreme, which said these things are not sanctioned in revelation. And some of the ulama are banning tobacco, and he issues a fatwa saying it's permissible. But Abdul Ghani Nablusi doesn't really have a problem with it, because there's no dalil that indicates that God is against it. So avoid the Qadizadeh's insistence that piety consists in making things prohibited wherever you can. This is part of a sickness which he deplored.
Timmy, you need to work on your study skills.
Firstly, Qadi Zadeli is a label coined by the Reform movement's foes. Their fans call them Faqihler, Turkic for Fuqaha, or Birghivi Khulafasi, successors of Imam Birghivi. Secondly, the characterization, or rather characterization, of the Faqihler as if a gang of knuckle-dragging, unibrow-rocking, party-pooping killjoys and naysayers stinks of sectarian envy. They were jurists who were concerned for the sanguine spirit of the Sharia as much as for its legal letter. Their jihad was for Mohammedan morality and piety. They strove to elevate Ottoman state and society towards worshipping Allah in His unicity upon orthodox praxis and in a state of sobriety. Naturally, this created for them a good many an enemy, from special interest groups whose privileges were purchased through corruption and whose pastors were corrupted by heresy. The libertine cults of shrine-worshipping Shia cum Sunni Sufis most especially.
And his battle with the Qadizadehs was a well-known one. And they were very active. They were smashing up taverns and demolishing Sufi lodges, and they were like kind of proto-Wahhabis in some way.
Timmy, don't call people names.
Lower caste preachers usually, Va'izan, not the senior muftis and the ulama who regarded them as kind of a vulgar embarrassment, but this is part of his battle.
The Qadi Zadeli were actually patronized by the state. They enjoyed the best teaching gigs at Constantinople's premier pulpits, venues that were booked for them by the empire's senior-most statesmen. Some reached the ranks of Padishah Sheikhi, the emperor's personal sheikh, or preacher to the palace guard. That's why they were able to trash taverns and libertine Sufi lodges, because they were enforcing imperial edicts under police escort, because the sultans held such venues that were frequented by Sufis to be denizens of sedition. That's not to say there wouldn't have been any overly zealous zealots. As with all morality police forces, you're gonna get the odd baker short of a bun, tripping on a power trip, hassling girls who just want to have fun. But the lasting contribution of the Qadi Zadeli were the written works of their scholars, those that popularized the defense of Tawheed from the teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah and his protege, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyyah.
Yo, to learn more about the Taymiyyah Turks, y'all check out these 2 episodes from my man's Ottoman Autopsy series, Dawn and Rise. And don't none of y'all forget to subscribe and share and donate to keep the project alive. Now, let's close out the show.
So what have we learned? That in Abdul Ghani and Nablusi, we saw the single greatest embodiment in a single person of the extreme Sufi strain that would increasingly come to characterize Ottoman Islam during the 18th century, a heretical impulse amongst Muslims distinguished by a disdain for the religious sciences of the Sharia, a mockery for the sanctities of the Sharia, venerating the dead in their graves as if they were gods, and even claiming to be God. And we saw how Nablusi would routinely insult the people of Sunnah, oftentimes dismissing them as Turks for daring to scrutinize innovated Sufi beliefs and practices.
Proto-Wahhabis in some way.
And we witness from Winter of Discontent the indefensible's indefatigable defense. Abdul Hakim's lauding Abdul Ghani was unwarranted in almost every sense. Because Nablusi was opposed not because he was a sober Sufi, but because he was a scandalous one. And while his opponents would assail him with book and sunnah based arguments bespoke, he'd hit back with ad hominem and bigotry while having a smoke. And we ought to have gained a greater appreciation also of the debt Ash'ari Sufis or the ancient Greeks for their innovated beliefs and their inappropriate motifs. And worse of all, also in the pathos of pagans past, we saw Nablusi justifying for the fickle masses acts and articles of shirk, such as belief in the incarnation of the divine, claiming to come close to Allah by gazing at boys and worshipping shrines.
احنا كمتصوفة ولسنا شيعة بيقولوا علينا ان احنا عبدة الأضرحة. بيقولوا على المتصوفين انهم عبدة الأضرحة. نعم، نحن عبدة الأضرحة التي تقربنا إلى الله سبحانه وتعالى، لأن هناك فرق بين القبر والضريح. القبر في مسلم عادي، أما الضريح ففي ولي من أولياء الله الصالحين أخلص لله، وربنا سبحانه وتعالى كرمه وجعل له مقام يزار.
ألا لله الدين الخالص والذين اتخذوا من دونه أولياء ما نعبدهم إلا ليقربونا إلى الله زلفى إن الله يحكم بينهم فيما هم فيه يختلفون إن الله لا يهدي من هو كاذب كفار.
And it wasn't just the righteous folk of Rome and Rumelia who made their protest against the mystics' misguidance known. Nablusi's fellow Syrian, a scholar of hadith from Aleppo, Sana'ullah bin Sana'ullah al-Halabi al-Hanafi, was perhaps his fiercest critic. In his Sayfullah ala man kadhaba ala awliya'illah, the sword of Allah upon the one who lies upon the allies of Allah, Sana'ullah castigates Nablusi for perverting the religion with shirk-infested shrine veneration. Within a generation, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and his followers would borrow from Halabi's works to aid their own jihad against grave worship. To play us out, let's also borrow from the rhyming introductory lines of Halabi's critique and marvel at just how evocative they are for us now of the as then yet to appear da'wah of the Najdi Sheikh.
هذا وإنه قد ظهر الآن فيما بين المسلمين جماعات يدعون أن للأولياء تصرفات في حياتهم وبعد الممات، ويستغاث بهم في الشدائد والبليات، وبهممهم تنكشف المهمات، فيأتون قبورهم وينادونهم في قضاء الحاجات، مستدلين على أن ذلك منهم كرامات، وقررهم على ذلك من ادعى العلم بمسائل وأمدهم بفتاوى ورسائل، وأثبتوا للأولياء بزعمهم الإخبار عن الغيب بطريق الكشف لهم بلا ريب، أو بطريق الإلهام أو منام. وهذا كما ترى كلام فيه تفريط وإفراط وغلو في الدين بترك الاحتياط، بل فيه الهلاك الأبدي والعذاب السرمدي، لما فيه من روائح الشرك المحقق ومصادرة الكتاب العزيز المصدق ومخالفة لعقائد الأئمة وما اجتمعت عليه هذه الأمة، فكل بناء على غير أصولهم تلبيس، وفي غير مناهجهم مخايل إبليس.
I've heard people say that too much of anything is not good for you, baby. It doesn't seem to me like it's enough. It's just not enough. Oh, baby. Oh, babe.